So good morning from a very cool Fradley Junction, or this is Middle Lock, just on the entry into Fradley Junction. I'm on my own today. I've come out, obviously very aware of social distancing. I'll bring myself out for a bit of a walk because we can do that. So I thought, let's have a little bit of a walk. I'll go down to Fradley Junction and do a little bit around on the history of this, so a little bit different to what I'd normally do. Whether that means I'm going to be boring, I don't know. Perhaps I'm always boring, who knows. So anyway, Fradley Junction, really interesting. I'm actually stood on the Trent Mersey at the moment. This is the Trent Mersey, and the junction leads you up onto the Coventry Canal. So I'm going to take you through a bit more detail around the history of that, how that happened, why that happened, and just some of the sights in and around. So hang on to your seats, it's going to be a wild ride. Not. All routes to the junction meet at the perfectly positioned Swan pub. It's also known as the Lucky Duck, and almost every vlogger and gongoozler in the country has photographed this pub at some point. It's possibly one of the most famous on the network. It's kind of my local junction. My moorings about 3 miles from here by canal, maybe a little bit more, over at Huddlesford. Now I'm parked up here in what is the car park of the Swan pub. Now the Swan pub is part of a long line of buildings called Junction Row. Now they would have been built for the workers of the canal, the people that were running it, that were looking after the junction, the lock keepers, the blacksmiths, the carpenters. They were stabling here for 22 horses. So the courtyard that's here, this would have been a proper hive of activity. This car park that I'm sat in now, this would have been part of that courtyard, and it would have been, they would have been making lock gates, they would have been shoeing the horses. All of those sorts of things that were required to keep the canals running would have been happening here, and obviously we had an inn. So here we have Junction Lock. It's on the Trent Mersey. It's on the route into the junction, coming from the River Trent that way. So Burton-on-Trent is over there. That direction, straight on up, past the pub, is off to Rugeley, Great Haywood, Stafford, ultimately all the way up to Liverpool. And here we have Fradley Pool. It used to be known as Fradley Reservoir. And this would have been built, this would have been dug out 1770-ish to supply water into the canal system at Fradley. Obviously got a few locks here, so you're always going to need a little bit of a reserve. Times of drought and lower water levels. So it's now a nature reserve. It's very popular here with dog walkers, lots of bird life, lots of ducks. It's all a bit bleak in the winter, but I don't know. There's always quite a beauty, I think, to wintry trees. There's always a brave robin, isn't there? The bravest of birds. And there's a bit more detailed information. So Fradley Junction, really key on the network, and it was a real key element of what was known as, or what was planned to be, the Grand Cross, which James Brindley was responsible for doing all the surveying of, the planning of, to make sure that they could try and join up all of the four key rivers that were already kind of navigable in their own right, but how would you join them up? So the Grand Cross
was the big idea. The first part of that really was the Trent Mersey. So that was running from the Mersey, so Liverpool, just south of Liverpool. Came down through Staffordshire, through the Potteries, through sort of Middle England, so kind of where we are now, and then going back sort of northeasterly, ultimately up onto the Trent, which then joined into the Humber estuary and went out through Hull. So that was kind of a scoop, like a U shape, coming through the country. So the Trent Mersey was absolutely vital for the transportation of raw materials into industry. So you had the brewing industry in Burton-on-Trent and sort of the Midlands, and you had the potteries industry in Staffordshire, in sort of Stoke-on-Trent and that sort of area. And actually the Trent Mersey, known as the Grand Trunk back in its day, after a round of arguments between many different businessmen and governments and things like that, the very first sod was dug by Josiah Wedgwood himself. So the guy who was responsible for the Wedgwood ceramics business and fine china and that sort of thing. He was key in wanting to be able to ship in raw materials and obviously take out his products and supply them around the world. So that was why that came through Burslem, was where that first sod was dug. They needed to join that into the River Severn, so from Great Haywood there was a junction, and that took you down the Staffs Worcester Canal off Great Haywood, and that went down southwest, down towards the Severn at Stourport. And they also needed to get down to London. The easiest way into London was to actually go to Oxford. So they went to Oxford, get on the Thames at Oxford, out through London. So that was all Brindley's kind of plan. I don't think he ever lived to see it all through, but he was responsible for the surveying of that. And they were what they called the contour canals, very windy, twisty things, trying to avoid locks if they could, trying to avoid tunnelling if they could. I mean, they had to, but trying to avoid it. So they were Brindley's canals. So Fradley Junction was the key element to linking into London, really. So taking the Trent and Mersey and being able to get down south, down towards Oxford. So it was the Coventry Canal, which was linking up with the Oxford Canal, with the North Oxford and then South Oxford, going down through Banbury and that way and down to Oxford.
So for all you boaters out there are a couple of very useful water points on this section of the Coventry Canal just prior to the swing bridge. So the famous Fradley swing bridge. If you're coming in from Coventry, ultimately London, then you would have to come through the swing bridge. This would have been a stop lock. This would have been where you would have to pay your fees, your charges. They may well have measured the draft of the boat, find out what cargo you got on. So Coventry, Tamworth, London, Birmingham, there's an offshoot to Birmingham, that direction. Fradley, Swan Pub. To the right, you're off to the Trent, ultimately all the way to the Humber estuary. To the left, you're heading to Liverpool. So Trent Mersey, Coventry Canal.
Now there's actually quite a story with regards to the Coventry Canal and how that was built. It suffered delays. So the Trent and Mersey Canal was completed by 1777. They'd started working from the Coventry end with the Coventry Canal, again Brindley, and they ran out of money. They actually went bump. Brindley apparently was a stickler for high quality, best workers, but he tended to be expensive. So he was replaced. So even though the plan was his, the survey was done by him, the actual Coventry Canal was completed by the Birmingham Faisley Canal Company. And there's a small element of the canal, if you look on maps and stuff, it's actually the Coventry Canal that we know, that runs from Fradley Junction to Coventry. There is a small section of it called the Birmingham and Faisley Canal. And there is a marker post along there which sort of signifies that. And that's because they took responsibility and they paid for that bit of work. But this, however, now, we all know this as the Coventry Canal. So in 1768, Fradley was recognised as the place to have a junction on the Trent Mersey. The Trent Mersey was already progressing, and it was almost, well, by 1777 it was done. The plan was to have the Coventry Canal ready at the same time, but it was beset by its financial issues, and it didn't actually get completed until about 1789. It's sketchy. Fradley was just a simple village really until the junction came along. The junction is probably about half a mile out of the actual main village of Fradley. However, this was where the Trent Mersey was coming, so this was where the junction was going to be. But I mean, there's always been a hamlet or a village of some type at Fradley. Dating back, you know, you go back to 12th century, there was a place here and it was known as Fradley, or sometimes people called it Fradley, and it was spelt like Fradley, which would be quite good if you're from the back country, because you'd probably still say Fradley. I went to Fradley Junction. You go even further back than then, you're really close to the joining of the River Tame with the River Trent, so confluence of the two rivers. So there's always been dwellings. The archaeology has shown lots of settlements in the area, sort of Bronze Age, Iron Age sort of settlements. And indeed, they actually found a really strong example of a fossilised skeleton of a woolly rhinoceros. Who knew there was such a thing as a woolly rhino? And that was discovered at Whitemore Hay, which is only about a mile, as a crow flies, away from Fradley Junction. And so that fossil exists, and it really is a terrific example of almost a full skeleton of that beast that walked the planet. So that's some sort of 42,000 years ago. So it showed that it was a very, very cold part of the world back in those days. So Fradley, situated on the old Roman road, the Icknield Street, and it also runs very closely to the junction with Watling Street. So the A5 is Watling Street. That's kind of going west to east, or west to southeast. Icknield Street coming up through the Midlands, really, from kind of Gloucestershire through to South Yorkshire, I think. So quite an important route on two Roman roads, really, in Fradley, Lichfield. It's all around that sort of area. So a very big sort of trading area, even, you know, many centuries before actually canals came into play. Now again, literally half a mile from where I'm sat now was Fradley airfield. So World War II, it was decided that there was a nice flat level area of land here, smack in the middle of the country, away from the coast a little bit, where we could put an airfield where we could have bombers. So when that first came into play, the women of the area did big stone clearing parties, really, and they would walk the fields and they would get rid of all the stones so they could get a very, very level area for the planes to land. However, it was still the planes were too heavy. They were digging into the fields, into the mud, so they decided that they would need to put concrete runways in place, which then turned it into a proper airfield. But they ran all sorts out of here. They ran Wellingtons, they ran Lancasters, the Hurricanes, the Spitfires. It all came out of here. And there were many airmen from many different countries. So not only did we have the Brits, but there was a very heavy Australian Air Force contingent, and I believe Czech. The Czechs also had a contingent of airmen here as well. So it was a very busy, very heavily used airfield. Some elements of it still exist. Most of it has now gone to housing, and an awful lot of it is now warehousing as well. So there's industries moved into that. So this is a pool. It's known as Fradley Pools these days, I believe. That's how it shows it on Google Maps. But it also is known by the name of Bown Pool, B-O-W-N. And it was given that name because of a guy known as Josiah Bown, who died tragically in here on his way back from the Bull's Head on Icknield Street in about 1820. So originally, back in the 1700s, late 1700s, this place was dug out to extract clay and gravel for the manufacture of bricks,
and other materials needed to actually make the canal. So they were taken away, formed into bricks. So the buildings that you see around the canals in this area and sort of lining locks and things like that, the raw materials came from here. So that's what created this pool. The island in the middle there apparently still has a diving platform on it. So the Australian airmen particularly liked congregating here in the summer months, and they would swim in this lake and they would dive in. The lake itself was used quite extensively for fishing contests, I believe, but there was an annual one, a famous annual fishing contest here for the children. But when the airfield was decommissioned in 1958, I believe, this place it grew over, really. Lots of silt and lots of weed, and it was unused. But since they've been doing the rebuild, there's a lot of new properties now over on the horizon there, and indeed there's a new work going on here. It's all been sort of tidied up, and I suppose it'll form a massive centrepiece of this whole area. Had I filmed this about 6 months ago, you'd have seen the old airfield hangars about there. So here endeth today's lesson. I hope you found it informative, because I certainly enjoyed researching the facts. But I tell you what, it's bizarre how there are so many conflicting facts out there when you actually start looking. You end up becoming a detective, trying to cobble together the most accurate version of events. But I guess stories over 250 years do evolve. To make it worse for myself, I end up going back 42,000 years. Idiot. Anyway, look out for more episodes on the key junctions in the Midlands coming very soon. Bye-bye for now.